It's our honor to host Susan Eisenhower. And yes, she's sort of related to the 34th president. She happens to be his granddaughter. In addition to that, she is a chair emeritus of the Eisenhower Institute. She is a well-respected person in the energy field. Chairman Chow recently asked her to be on a Blue Ribbon Commission regarding our nuclear future. She has 3 other books that she has written about, one of which happens to be about her very famous grandmother, Mrs. Ike, and she also wrote one called Partners in Space and another one. This book as much as I do, take a moment and pick up the other 3. All of her books will be available at the Learned Owl on Main Street, and she will have signed book plates in them. So if you're interested, please go to the Learned Owl and purchase these books. I have to tell you, I really was not alive during Mr. Eisenhower's administration, but I've come to know a great deal about him by reading this book. So it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Eisenhower. Susan, want to say hello?
Yes, hello. And Gwen, it's just great to be with you. Thank you for this wonderful invitation.
Susan's newest book is called How Ike Led, and it examines the leadership qualities of her grandfather. It was a delight to read, and I actually learned a great deal about his leadership qualities, among other things. First and foremost, I thought it was really interesting that when he was asked to run for the presidency by the Republican Party, they based their petition upon the fact that he had outstanding leadership qualities. Can you tell us a little bit about that process, Susan?
Well, it's worth remembering that Dwight Eisenhower, before being solicited by both the Republicans and the Democrats to run on either one of these tickets, was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe that successfully defeated Nazism during World War II. So by the time the 1952 campaign came around, Eisenhower had been a favorite to run for years, even though he had taken on other assignments, including the first command of NATO. But it is sort of interesting, Gwen, that nobody knew whether he was a Democrat or Republican because he was a military man and had never declared himself.
I thought it was very interesting in the beginning you make the distinction between strategic versus operational leaders. And because we think of him and associate him primarily with the military, it would stand to reason that he had very strategic leadership. Can you sort of go over the difference slightly between strategic and operational and how he fit the bill?
Well, I guess the major difference is that a strategic leader has to pull all of the pieces together. He, in his own mind, has to make decisions based on everything from resources and timelines to manpower to politics to changing conditions on the ground, and he is the person who brings it all together. Operational leaders, on the other hand, have a slice of the overall mission, but not responsibility for integrating all the pieces into meeting the mission's goals. Now, what I just said sounds pretty academic. It's just a notation I made in the book that as a 5-star general and a president of the United States, his job was to be a strategic leader and not to be down in the weeds like an operational leader. And I think that's, that's the reason for the distinction.
I also thought it was interesting, yet as a strategic leader, sort of getting down in the weeds and talking to his men and using that soft power was very important to him.
Well, that's right. One of the biggest... I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that being close to his troops during the war, of course, is a very, very big part of a strategic question. Eisenhower saw morale as being critical to success. In other words, you build morale in the beginning so that that morale can be harnessed for a larger mission. Many people think that morale comes because you're victorious. Well, no, everybody's happy you've won, but you've got to have people in the right frame of mind to be the kind of assets they need to be in war or even as president.
Another quality that you mentioned a great deal about was his self-control. And I think that, unfortunately, some of us in our modern society may lack a little control in things. It impressed me very much to read about the fact that Mr. Eisenhower allowed the French to liberate France during World War II rather than rush in and become the big hero and gain the accolades. He was very much about controlling his emotions and controlling events as much as one can. Would you agree?
I would, and one of the things that was exciting for me in doing this research is to actually piece together what I knew of him as a person and now his military and political record. So I should just say very quickly, Gwen, that I was raised to compartmentalize these two things completely, or the best of my ability. That is my relationship with my grandfather versus his public, his standing with the public, etc. So one of the things that I put together in this book was actually, he was a very passionate person, and he had very deeply held feelings. But to read the research and the scholarship and to read the documents, and it's extraordinary to see how carefully he manages, you might say, his interior space. And of course, that is a critical part of the job. He also believed, certainly in wartime, but you could also imagine this in the presidency, that optimism is something that he had to project all the time, even during crises, because people are very, very affected by pessimism. And you can't get troops to go into battle if they don't trust their commander, and if they think that the commander's worried and isn't sure of the mission's success.
I found another key quality about him to be admired was his sense of duty. He was very driven to serve, essentially, and serve even when it was uncomfortable. At one point you mentioned the fact that he would have regular breakfasts with the members of Congress, and he may detest these men to the bottom of his toes, and yet every week he would sit down and have breakfast with them to establish a rapport and to understand what they were feeling.
Yeah, I think he had a remarkably good relationship with the vast majority in Congress. And it's noteworthy because when he's elected in 1952 and becomes president in 53, the Republicans squeak through with a small majority, but certainly after the midterm elections in 54, the Democrats took over both House and Senate. And despite the fact that he had the opposite party on Capitol Hill, I try and unpack how he managed to get 80% of his legislative agenda through a Democratic House and Senate. And part of that was inviting them to breakfast, hearing them out, and turning the other party into partners in these projects rather than adversaries. Frankly, Gwen, part of the reason a lot of this is in there is I think many readers will find it surprising how much has actually changed in our society since those days, or certainly in our political environment.
One note that I found very interesting was later, after he had retired, he was having a discussion with someone apparently when he was at Gettysburg at the farm, and they asked him about the weather. And he said that he hadn't paid attention to the weather since June 6, 1945, which I thought really spoke to how he had an ability to sort of move on and let things go.
Well, I think he became very adept at not sweating the small stuff. And that, yeah, well, of course, June 6th was D-Day. And as we all remember, the weather forecast was very dicey. As a matter of fact, even the weather team, before the largest amphibious landing in military history, and certainly one of the very, very largest operations. And no, after that, pretty much all of it was small stuff. Certainly at his level, though, he had the big worries. And he left weather forecasts and worrying about whether or not crowd should be moved in to an auditorium in case of rain. That wasn't anything he was going to worry about.
What would you say in terms of his leadership qualities, what one really sticks out in your mind above all the others?
Well, first of all, he didn't believe in double standards, one standard for the bosses and one standard for everybody else. So he was very, very careful, and I would say almost, adamant. Adamant's the word. During the war, he often, I don't think it was maybe a good idea, but he wouldn't even go into bomb shelters when he could absolutely avoid it because the GIs didn't have access to those. Of course, his security team wasn't going to be letting him do that all the time. But I guess the point I make in a chapter on this is that small gestures really matter. And he had a touch. He had a touch with his GIs, and he had a touch with the American voter. In other words, when they started a bit of an austerity program in the first presidential term, Ike went on an austerity program too, and he just didn't spend any money on White House redecorations or garden refurbishments. My grandmother Mamie never had the opportunity to decorate the White House because Ike said, if I'm asking American citizens to tighten their wallets here, or not their wallets, but tighten the services that the government's going to offer while trying to balance the budget, then you're not going to be decorating the White House. And my grandmother used to even use her own car instead of a presidential limousine to go up to Gettysburg. And I think the other thing, Gwen, you may remember this part, is that when Ike's youngest brother came to the White House on official business, Ike paid back the federal treasury a certain room rate for his brother to stay overnight.
Brother.
Yeah, and it's those gestures, I think, that he thought were important for creating confidence.
Susan, what can you tell me about how his family, your family, sort of instilled some of these character traits in him that became sort of family traits?
Oh, well, it may have, I don't, it's always interesting how much, what qualities stay in a family and which ones don't, but he instilled a lot in us. And I think one of the things that's been most valuable in my own career is that he used to say all the time, not just to me, but also to his associates who I knew after his death, who had worked with him at the White House he would often say in the course of analysis, how does it look to the other guy? So in other words, he was very conscious of the people who are impacted by his decisions. But anyway, that discipline, when you're analyzing a situation, the discipline of understanding the context of other people's position is the way to make good strategy. It's certainly a way to avoid some big pitfalls. And it helped me a lot. That part helped me a lot in my career.
We know that he was trained militarily, but what can you tell us about who he respected and honored, who he looked up to, who he wanted to emulate?
Well, that's an excellent question. Eisenhower loved George Washington. I mean, he studied George Washington's career. I'm sure that he was attracted to Washington for a whole range of reasons, but one of them might have been that Washington himself had been a military man, had taken, played an indispensable role in our Revolutionary War. Eisenhower also admired Abraham Lincoln, but I have to tell our audience this evening that you might be surprised to know that the Eisenhowers were pacifists. Ida Stover Eisenhower, Ike's mother, my great-grandmother, decided after the Civil War, she was a young girl, that she would have nothing to do with military activity, and she joined a religious group that were conscientious objectors. So you can imagine how interesting that was when one of their own went off to West Point for an education. In any case, I think those are certainly some factors.
What can you tell me about the people he surrounded himself with? I don't know, the next ones down from him, the associates and his colleagues that helped to get him to where he was at. Could they see the qualities of a good leader in him?
Well, yes. I mean, I was very fortunate, as I said earlier, to have known many of them, including General Andrew Goodpaster, who was Eisenhower's day-to-day national security person. He really was my mentor. I learned a lot about my grandfather from him after my grandfather died. I would say that he had a remarkable relationship with his associates. If you can imagine this, Dwight Eisenhower had the same press secretary for 8 solid years.
Wow.
I mean, people came. General Goodpaster arrived at the White House in 2 years after Ike became president, and stayed with President Eisenhower for the rest of his term. So there was real kind of stability and longevity to those appointments. Now, let me say one other thing, which is interesting, is that Ike liked to be surrounded by people of differing viewpoints, because Ike thought it was important to be very clear in the dimensions of any problem. And he always worried that any human being would come and look at a problem with their own set of default assumptions. And so he would have this range of people, from very conservative people to, liberal Republicans in his cabinet. And they gave him lots of pushback, lots of debate. And then the president would make his decision in a quiet room. And then they had a special person to implement his decisions. But of course, that's very different than it is today. Most of our political parties surround themselves with, people who are of the same party or pretty much the same view. But I found the other way worked better for him, and it was how it worked during the war. He didn't have a choice over everybody who worked for him during the war, because it was a multinational integrated coalition. But he got used to that pushback. He liked to hear what people had to say, and liked to hear the different dimensions of a problem.
Now, Susan, everybody has faults,
Yeah.
even Dwight Eisenhower. I'm told that he was somewhat stubborn. Do you think that some of those qualities or faults helped him become a better leader?
Well, that's interesting, turning your liabilities into an asset. I think he could probably be stubborn. Let's put it this way, at least politically, he was able to withstand a lot of criticism. And I think, first of all, I'm not going to describe whether that's an asset or a liability. But he had risen to command in the United States Army and had successfully defeated the Nazis. And I think he had probably good reason to feel confident about his judgment. But I think the thing that Americans, like you used that word duty earlier, I think Americans find it hard to understand this commitment to duty, which is a very military concept. It means self-sacrifice is what it means. And so that sense of self-sacrifice was always with him, and it helped him stand up to things, you might say, in a way. Now, in the faults department, because yes, he was absolutely a human being, as we all are. He had a temper that he worked on all of his life. I told you he was a very passionate person, and he had all kinds of tricks for how to manage his temper, because if you have to maintain a kind of self-discipline, and getting your temper under control is important. But he used to write down the thing that was bothering him on a piece of paper, crumple it up, and throw it into a bottom drawer. And he did this at the White House for 8 years. His secretary, who must have had to have a security clearance in order to remove those pieces of paper, if you can imagine, she of all people knew what upset him, on a daily basis because of all these little crumpled up papers. So yeah, he had a temper, and I guess he didn't really like politics that much either. And I think that might have been a shortcoming, though I believe that the country benefited by having probably, arguably, certainly the most nonpartisan president of the 20th century. And I think if you go back, before that we had the Civil War. So again, he is in a way emulating George Washington in that particular way.
He had a keen sense of a devotion to truth. I mean, he didn't like anybody to sugarcoat anything when they brought it to him. And he was fairly decent, I think, at assessing other people. And of course, he had to make numerous appointments as president. Do you think that he specifically chose his appointed judges or what have you based upon criteria?
Oh, he definitely had criteria for judges. And I can tell you this, no white supremacists need apply. As a matter of fact, Ike's judicial appointments are probably one of the pillars of his civil rights legacy, because he was the one who appointed the judges that desegregated the South in the 1960s. Those were Eisenhower appointments. John Minor Wisdom, Frank Johnson, a whole long list of very distinguished judges who outlasted the Eisenhower presidency for decades to come. And so, yeah, I think that's a very big part of his legacy, for sure.
Would you speak a bit about his civil rights legacy and, his commitment to civil rights?
Yeah, well, he definitely was committed to civil rights. During World War II, he made it possible, certainly at the time of the Battle of the Bulge, for African-American troops to volunteer for that campaign. And he worked to bring them into a proper hierarchy. After the war, he took Harry Truman's executive order to desegregate the military, and he took it, to a much greater level. That executive order had not really gotten started when Eisenhower became president. And then he did all kinds of things. And this is the interesting thing, Gwen, it's back to strategic leadership. Even though my book is really a collection of stories, my objective has been to show strategic leadership instead of tell strategic leadership. So it's not an academic book. It's a book that is designed to leave you understanding what that is. So in the civil rights area, I call that chapter Establishing a Beachhead. He knew he had only 8 years, if he was lucky, 4 to 8 years. So what he did is what he could control during that period of time. By the time his 8 years was over, he had desegregated almost everything that the federal government controlled in the area. He desegregated Washington, D.C. As his first order of business. Then he appointed Earl Warren, and as we know, the desegregation of schools began with the very dramatic moment at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the governor of Arkansas was in violation of the Supreme Court ruling, and Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to escort 9 African-American young people to high school. So it's I think I get a lot of people saying, oh, they're surprised about some of this, because he just wasn't a person who thought he should be bragging about accomplishments like this. He thought it was a stain on our country that we had not done more in this area, and bragging about it would be making him the center of attention as opposed to steps towards American justice.
Bill wants me to ask you about anecdotes with regard to leaders of World War II. Do you have any special ones that he might have had with de Gaulle or Churchill?
Well, actually, I have to say that being his granddaughter had some downsides. I mean, one of them was 8 years of Secret Service protection. Having said that, I did have an opportunity to meet many of these extraordinary leaders who came to visit President Eisenhower, and they all came. And then they also came up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania during the presidency, or to Camp David, but Winston Churchill was one of them. Charles de Gaulle came, Konrad Adenauer, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first prime minister of independent India, and they came. I didn't meet Nehru, but I certainly met de Gaulle, and that was an extraordinary occasion because you mentioned that a minute ago, Gwen, about the liberation of Paris. And General Eisenhower was the person who stood behind de Gaulle, even though the Americans were very skeptical of this French general, and Winston Churchill positively couldn't stand him. But Eisenhower understood that Paris had to be secured because our troops would not have the time to stay behind and try and keep Paris from politically collapsing. And so Eisenhower and de Gaulle had a remarkable relationship, even though at times French-American relations were somewhat testy, mostly around NATO and other issues. But they had an extraordinary relationship, and I will never forget as long as I live that at Granddad's funeral, Charles de Gaulle came to that funeral dressed in his World War II uniform and saluted that coffin. I'm telling you, it was just very, very moving. And then, of course, the other great visitor during that time, when I say great, I mean in quotes, notable, let's say that, was the arrival of Nikita Khrushchev in 1959 for his 10-day whirlwind trip around the United States and some very tough negotiations over the future of Berlin.
I found it very interesting, and it really spoke to the man's humility that on May 7th of 1945, General Eisenhower did not want to be there when the Germans actually to accept their surrender. It really speaks to his humbleness as a human being and yet as a leader in some ways. And talk to me about his relationship with Mr. Montgomery. Is there some discussion about Mr. Montgomery making a secret trip to Gettysburg, perhaps?
Oh, actually, well, you know, the funny thing is, I actually had the opportunity to meet Monty, too. And one of the fun things about this, my grandmother, and I don't know how it is, Gwen, that I ended up writing a book about both of them. There's 25 years between Mrs. Ike, the book I wrote, and now How Ike Led. But anyway, I was amused by the fact my grandmother liked who she liked. That's all there was. It doesn't matter whether her husband got along with them. If she liked them, she liked them. She adored Monty. She thought he was adorable, and she knew exactly how to, the British love conversational repartee. And boy, my grandmother could dish it out as good as it came in. So Monty arrives at the White House and looks around the White House and sniffs. Well, it's not Buckingham Palace. To which Mamie says, thank goodness for that. So Monty thought she was adorable. She thought he was great. Ike, on the other hand, had, some headaches thanks to Monty. But I think in the end, despite a big dust up in 1959 when Monty came out with his memoirs, I think they really respected each other. At the end of the day, the British look at strategy very differently than Americans do. And the British do not like direct assaults on anything. I don't know how many people realize this, but it was the Americans who wanted the cross-channel invasion and to directly assault the coastline of France and move directly to the heart of Germany. It was the Brits who wanted to go around to other places, obviously first North Africa and then Sicily, and up the Italian boot. And at one point, Churchill even wanted us to go through the Balkans. And so the Americans prevailed on that. So all of these fascinating wartime people who had differences of opinion, and it was Ike's job to keep everybody on the same page and moving forward. So you can see how that skill came in very handy when he got to Washington as president.
How did he learn that? Was it because he had three other brothers that he sort of had to keep all going down the same path, or?
Well, I think he was a little bit of the family troublemaker there for as a young kid. He had as I said, he had a little bit of he had a temper, all right, and but he became particularly emotional about things related to injustice and the rest of it. I think he was exceedingly fortunate to have the benefit of a little family secret sauce, which is a father who was the disciplinarian, who taught Ike self-restraint and self-discipline, and his mother, who was a loving, wonderful, deeply religious person. And she talked to him about cooperation and about opportunity and about a higher calling, that a higher cause, I should say. She was always telling these boys, but it stuck most with Ike, I think, that God wants you to be modest. You are humble in his presence. And, you know, this was just ingrained in him. So I think many scholars don't really understand Dwight Eisenhower because they really don't understand the spirituality of that family. But it would have been unthinkable for him to be the braggart, you know, the center of attention all the time.
You said he had an expression called show ponies, someone that was very much a braggart and an extrovert, and he never wanted to be this show pony kind of a person. That sort of leads me into my question about his vice president. Do you have a sense of why he selected Nixon, or how he came to choose Nixon?
Well, we have to remember that in those days, the convention chose the vice president and not the presidential candidate. So you did not put together a ticket before your nomination. That just didn't happen. And I'm afraid I don't know enough about the finer points of when that changed for the first time. Nixon was seen by the convention, and no doubt by Dwight Eisenhower too, as an asset. He was a well-known conservative Republican from the state of California. There are a lot of electoral votes that go with the state of California, as we all know. And I wouldn't call Nixon, though, a show pony. The kind of show ponies are, those would be the Douglas MacArthurs or the, well, Douglas MacArthur does come immediately to mind, doesn't he? But these are the people who are always at the center of attention. I have my own opinions about the show ponies in more recent times. They're the guys who are always at the microphone and don't let anybody else have a chance to talk. And the reason I didn't like that is that he thought that it would undermine the potential for cooperation if you weren't giving other people the opportunity to receive public appreciation and to be part of the limelight. And, you know, these were all very practically based considerations.
Which brings me to my next question. Certainly when he was looking for a spouse and casting about, he came upon Mamie. Can you discuss how they met and what qualities in her that he just absolutely fell in love with?
Well, first of all, these two were hysterical, if you really think about it. This is alpha male meets quintessential feminism. Ike was one of 7 boys, 6 surviving boys, and Mamie was one of 4 girls. And they were both, neither of them was the eldest, but they were, you know, he was very male and she was very female. Oh my gosh, was she ever. Well, so in that respect, opposites definitely enjoyed attraction. So they met in Fort Sam Houston after Ike had graduated from West Point and was sent down there to, you know, during the difficulties with Mexico and Pancho Villa and that whole chapter before World War I. And they met at the post, and Mamie was all decked out in her, you know, her French frilly outfit. She was a very well-dressed young Denver debutante. And Ike looked pretty good in a uniform, I can tell you, and they started this big flirtation. But my grandmother was tremendously clever. He asked for a date and she wouldn't let him have one. She was too busy doing something else. And I mean, this kind of thing went on, I mean, honestly. And, you know, it's remarkable that two people so different, you know, had an extraordinary devotion to each other. And my grandmother sacrificed a lot to be an Army wife. And he told her early on, I think before their marriage, he said, you know, my country is always going to come first, and you need to think about this. Well, she didn't have to think about anything. She was already hooked.
The one area we've not touched on yet, where his leadership was also exemplified, is Columbia. What can you tell me about his time at Columbia?
Well, Ike had a very idealistic streak, and he really thought that after the war, he would be able to retire to an academic institution somewhere and have a tremendous amount of interaction with students, and that he could make a contribution. He'd seen so much of history. He had shaped so much of history. And he was an avid enthusiast of reading books of history. And so he was very interested in all of that. Of course, the Columbia faculty, I think, couldn't quite figure out how they ended up with a general and not, you know, a PhD from some other university. And I won't say that there was tension, but there was a lot of skepticism, probably among some of the faculty there. But Ike forged some extraordinarily important relationships at Columbia while he was president, especially with the scientific community, because when the presidency, especially in the second term, is facing some very, very big technical challenges, he calls in his Columbia physicists from his days as president of Columbia University, and gives them some very, very important jobs in the development of rocketry and assessing, you know, the scientific challenges facing the United States. So I think it was an excellent chapter in his life, but I don't think it was very sustainable because, you know, President Truman asked Eisenhower to go be the first commander of NATO, and you don't turn down the President of the United States. And so he went to do that. And then after that, he was, whether he knew it or not, or wanted it or not, he was on his way to the White House.
Which sort of brings up my next question. How did your family adapt to the White House? What did your parents have to say? What memories do you have, if any, of the White House?
Well, I have a lot of memories of the White House. As a matter of fact, I was kind of wondering what happened to the parakeet we buried there in the Rose Garden when it was recently renovated by Melania Trump. We had been allowed to find a little spot over by one of the bushes to give Pete the parakeet a dignified burial, and I've always wondered what happened to that little box that we buried Pete in. You know, for the people who are living there, it really is home for as long as they the central person, the President of the United States, is in that house. My siblings and I spent a lot of time there, and also with my grandparents on their Gettysburg farm, because we were a very tightly knit family. There were only 4 of my generation, and my father was my grandparents' only surviving child. And so we were close. And as I describe in the book, people who are in positions of that kind of leadership, under that kind of pressure, have a default position to surround themselves with their families. Now, I'm not necessarily saying in official positions, but certainly, you know, the family plays a kind of relaxing role for somebody who has that much responsibility.
Thank you. What can you tell us about what did Ike aspire to? What did he ever want to be? I mean, he clearly didn't want to get into politics. Did he have a greater aspiration?
Well, I think, you know, his own trajectory is extremely interesting. Ike, as you mentioned, he had all these brothers. He was number 3 in line. The first brother, Arthur, went off to Kansas City and became a banker. His next brother, Edgar, who actually has a rather important place in this book, was very different than Ike, but he shared Ike's star quality and his interest in sports, and he was really quite a charismatic character. But Edgar went off to the University of Michigan, and my grandfather, came from a financially challenged family. They were just farmers in Kansas, and I shouldn't say just, but those were small farms, and all the kids had their own plots and sold their own vegetables door to door in town. And so Ike put Edgar through college, or at least well into his third year, and then kind of gave up hope that he was going to have the opportunity to be educated. And a friend of his had the idea that he might apply to one of the military academies. Ironically, he applied to Annapolis first and was turned down because he was too old. So remember, Eisenhower is a bit older than everybody else in his class. And then he applied, and just by almost accident, because the person in front of him could not go to the academy, Ike goes to West Point because he wants a free education. Very much like President Grant. General Grant also went to West Point to get a free education. After that, he always wanted to be an Army officer. And I don't think that the presidency had ever been on his mind. But there was that crucial moment in 1952 when Robert Taft, who was the candidate apparent in the 1952 election, would not support American internationalism. He was an isolationist, and Eisenhower decided that if Robert Taft isn't going to support NATO and isn't going to support America's new role in the world, then he'd have to run for president himself.
Tell me about how Ohio almost lost its Governorrauch.
Well, it's so funny that you would have remembered that. Well, yes, Governorrauch was apparently being discussed as a possible presidential contender to run against Eisenhower in 56. And so it's actually a rather charming story. He calls President Eisenhower on the telephone and said, really, honestly, Mr. President, I'm really not a candidate. And Ike says, well, why don't you come on over to the White House and we'll talk about it. Let's have a meal. And then they started making a little joke between them. I'll tell you what, I'll put you on the ticket. You can run as my vice president. Then we'll have a Republican and Democratic ticket. I don't know, this sort of joke between them or something went on for some time. But apparently, they had a terrific relationship, the two of them. And I guess it's just, fate intervened. Otherwise, your governor might have... Who knows what would happen if he had been on that ticket. But it's just one of those fun little footnotes. And I found most of the information on that story in Ike's diary, because he was a big diarist. And that's where he would pour out his frustrations and his irritations, all part of, temper control and personality management, right?
Speaking of frustrations, certainly the name MacArthur enters the book, does it not?
MacArthur, McCarthy, both of them enter the book, actually, and both of them were sources of frustration. So in the case of MacArthur, General MacArthur was Ike's boss for a long time, And then what I think is funny about that story is he wanted desperately to be president of the United States. And his protege, Dwight Eisenhower, ended up being president, and by the way, beating him in the very convention that MacArthur had hoped to win. So that's one frustration. And then Joseph McCarthy, oh my, that's another complicated story, but it's really actually quite a simple one. Eisenhower was a constitutionalist, and he, more than many of our presidents, understood that you have to be both head of state, head of the executive branch, and head of your political party simultaneously. The Constitution, unfortunately, gives our president, an impossible job. So what was interesting is that when he won in 1953, or 52 and was inaugurated in 53, you have for the first time the Republicans coming back to power since Herbert Hoover. That is just at the dawn of the Great Depression. And he had this job. Eisenhower had the difficult task of trying to keep Joseph McCarthy from ruining the Republicans' first opportunity at power to pass a lot of legislation that Eisenhower wanted passed. At the same time, Joseph McCarthy being on a rampage, accusing people of being communists who were nothing of the kind. And so Ike's strategy was to, yes, assure that we had a rigorous security investigation stroke process to assure that we did not have communists in government. But then here's the controversial thing he did. He knew as President of the United States that he had no authority over a co-equal branch of government. So what he had to do was to find another way to remove McCarthy's power without removing him from office. Okay, he had no authority over this. So he did one thing that he knew would drive McCarthy crazy. Ike managed for a year and a half never to mention Joseph McCarthy's name publicly, ever. And all Joseph McCarthy wanted to do was to start a public fight and get everybody to take sides and get things all wound up, kind of the way it's going on today. You know, everybody's so wound up. And Ike said, I don't believe in it. If I get down in the gutter with that guy, it will diminish the prestige of the presidency, and all he wants to do is to run for president. And so he used the bully pulpit, Eisenhower did, to talk about the principles that no, only Americans can hurt America, right? And that you don't fight communism by destroying our democracy. He'd say things like that, but he would never use McCarthy's name. And then McCarthy finally kept trying to egg the president on. He attacks the president's brothers, he attacks the president, it goes on like this, and then he attacks the United States Army. And that's when everything begins to change. A televised hearing soon makes it very clear to the American public that Senator McCarthy's unhinged. And guess what? Not long after that, the Senate censured their own member. But that whole thing took a year and a half. And the president could have attacked McCarthy, but he didn't have any authority to remove him constitutionally. So all that would have done would be to make McCarthy more important than he really was. Yeah, it's still controversial, but I have no doubt in my mind that since he didn't have the authority, he handled it in the only effective way with very few options, actually.
What would I say his greatest accomplishment is, or was? Well, I would say it would be two things, or at least this is Susan saying it on his behalf, is that he ended the Korean War in July of 1953, and thereafter there were no combat deaths in the United States military. He kept the peace for 8 years, and there were no combat deaths after the Korean War. That's number one. And then, you know, you'd say peace and prosperity, but on the prosperity side, I think he's still the only president today that actually paid down some of America's debt after World War II. He balanced the budget 3 times, came very close on another 2 or 3, and left his successor, John Kennedy, with a budget surplus. And this was without a peace dividend. This was done in the middle of a very dangerous part of the Cold War. And so I think that was an accomplishment too, for sure. What about the Republican Party? Certainly it's a different party today than it was during your grandfather's lifetime, but he had his issues at the same time. What can you speak to the Republican Party and your grandfather?
Well, I can say that the Republican Party, we don't need to get into an analysis of the Democratic Party either. I think both parties are at turning points. And what's interesting about the 1952 period is that the Republican Party was at a very, very big turning point then. Even in some ways every bit as big as it is today, because of these big divisions within the party about isolationism versus internationalism. And here this five-star general gives up his five-star commission to run for president. That was pretty courageous to do, I'd say. And he takes up the mantle of America's place in the world, to be a global leader. And what few people realize is that still the majority of Republicans in Congress, they were Taft people. They weren't Eisenhower people. And somehow over the course of this 8 years, Eisenhower managed to reshape the Republican Party to become the international party it was until this period. And I'm not saying that until this period like it's all over. No, I mean, the party is still debating this issue. But it's fascinating how over the course of these 8 years, Eisenhower reshapes the way the Republican Party looks at the United States and its role in the world. The fact that this is under debate again now makes it a very interesting time to observe and watch, and we just don't know exactly what's going to happen.
How did he get along with George Patton?
Oh, well, George Patton actually was known as Georgie. I know this because they knew each other from way back, and they were real pals in the 1920s. They lived on a couple of army posts together, and they were the two tank guys in the Army. As a matter of fact, Dwight Eisenhower commanded the first tank training unit at Camp Colton, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And by the way, Gwen, you might be interested to know, if I had known we were going to have a pandemic, I would have certainly put a chapter in there about the 1918 pandemic, because young Eisenhower, about 27 years old, was commanding people at Camp Colt, teaching them how to use tanks. And then in September of 1918, two men come into the camp who have been infected with the Spanish flu, influenza, and the camp caught this terrible flu. And Ike had to manage the camp and the town of Gettysburg. And he was later given a very high medal in the Army, the Distinguished Service Medal at the age of 28 for what he did at Camp Colt. Now, so after Camp Colt was over and Ike was recognized as this tank man, he and George Patton became very close friends. Of course, for many of you out there, you know that during World War II, of course, I think George Patton gave his old friend Ike some headaches as well. But Patton was certainly audacious in the battlefield, and Ike needed him. That's what it boiled down to. But there's a sort of sadness to the ending of their relationship in Patton's life, but that was tough. War's tough, and a lot of relationships changed as a result of that war. Some of them for better, and some of them with sadder endings.
One question that still sort of persists with us today is the two Koreas, North Korea and South Korea. Did President Eisenhower have any strong feelings about the two Koreas or their relationship with China?
Well, first of all, Ike, you may remember after he was elected president in 1952 and before he was inaugurated in 1953, he made good on his famous campaign promise to go to Korea. I will go to Korea. So he went over there in a secret visit, and he took a helicopter ride over the front, military front, and came back, met some of his advisors, but he concluded that the Korean War was not winnable, and it was the worst of all worlds in that blood and treasure would be lost. It'd be bled dry in a sense. And the failure to resolve the conflict itself threatened to get larger with the advent of nuclear weapons. Ike did not believe in small bleeding wars. He did not believe in it. He thought that eventually they could get bigger and more complicated and cause more damage. That's a sophisticated subject, so you're not getting a sophisticated answer here. I think you'll have more luck with it in my book. But having said that, this was an armistice. It was, in July of 1953. And they were able to negotiate this armistice, with the parties concerned in this conflict. I should just add one more thing that's fascinating here, which is that one of the reasons the isolationists and the conservatives in the Republican Party hated the UN is because they made the case that Harry Truman had received authorization to intervene in Korea by the United Nations, not by the United States Congress. And I'm sure that is a little subtlety, at least as far as Harry Truman was concerned. But this is why you often see isolationists particularly virulent about the United Nations itself. Eisenhower believed in the United Nations, so that was another point of departure for the two groups.
When your grandparents leave the White House, certainly there's always a conversation between a man and his successor. What did your grandparents, in particular your grandmother, think of Jackie Kennedy?
Oh, I think that there's been so much nonsense written about, I don't know how Jackie Kennedy felt. And so I'll have to leave that up to, Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg to analyze. But I can say certainly that my grandmother, had good feelings about her. I think what people forget is that a torch was going to be passed to a new generation, whether it was the Kennedy or the Nixons, because of the age difference. You remember, Ike has already been through the war, and he is, at that time, the oldest president to leave the White House. And so it's not surprising that Jacqueline Kennedy probably seemed more like a daughter to my grandmother than anything else. I will say that my grandmother helped Jacqueline Kennedy raise money for what is today the Kennedy Center. It was known as the National Cultural Arts Center, started during the Eisenhower administration. But even during the White House years, the Kennedy White House years, my grandmother helped with that project. And so I think all of these differences have been way over exaggerated.
Susan, we really appreciate you coming this evening and talking to us. I want to tell you that you should be very proud of this book and very proud of the fact that even Henry Kissinger adored your book. Some have called it a riveting tour de force, and others said that your writing and the story of Ike was greatly enhanced by your very sensitive nature and the fact that you are a family member divulging some of your intimate moments. So again, I want to take a moment and say thank you for doing this.
Well, it was a real pleasure, Gwen. I just want to thank everybody who's joined us this evening and continue to support this wonderful library. It's been an honor for me to be with you.
Thank you very much, and we wish you well.
Thank you so much.
And remember, everybody, the book is called How Ike Led. It's available at the Learned Owl, so take a moment and stop by and get it there or get it at the library. I assume that your grandparents were great readers?
They were indeed. They were indeed.
Well, we greatly appreciate your time and your insight into them this evening, so thank you very much.
Thank you. I should just end on the note that Eisenhower was such an avid reader that his mother had to lock up his history books in the closet so he'd do his chores. How's that?
Thank you, and I wish you a good night.